The courthouse was quiet, save for the rustling of papers and the faint shuffle of footsteps on the polished floors. Judge Thomas Reynolds sat behind a high wooden desk, his stern eyes scanning the papers before him. Naomi Parker stood before him, calm but determined. She was used to being in the spotlight. She had spent years advocating for equality and justice. But today, she found herself in an unexpected position, facing a fine, a consequence of her peaceful protest. Naomi had been gathering a small group in the town's Central Park, holding signs, distributing flyers, and engaging in discussions about the need for federal protections for LGBTQ+ individuals. The group's message was simple yet powerful: equality for all. Yet, the small-town atmosphere, deeply rooted in tradition and wary of change, didn't share Naomi's sense of urgency. The local authorities had warned her that her protest lacked the proper permit, but Naomi, undeterred, continued to stand firm in her beliefs. Judge Reynolds had always prided himself on upholding the law with precision, and to him, this was a clear case of rule-breaking. When Naomi appeared before him in his courtroom, he hardly saw the person behind the cause. He only saw a violation, a disturbance, a disruption to the peace that had been carefully cultivated in his community. His ruling was swift and final. Naomi would be fined $500 for protesting without a permit. As the gavel struck down, Naomi felt a knot form in her stomach. This wasn't just about a fine. It was about silencing a voice that was pushing for change. But she stood tall, her gaze unwavering, as she looked at the judge and then at the crowd. She knew the impact of her words and actions stretched far beyond this moment. This was about a larger fight for justice, for equality, for human dignity. And this small town with its quiet streets and familiar faces was where it would begin. The judge, on the other hand, felt no such sense of conflict. To him, the law was simple. It wasn't personal. Naomi had broken the rules. That was all there was to it. He didn't know her story, didn't know that Naomi had spent years tirelessly advocating for the rights of others. He had no idea that her protest wasn't a random disruption, but a heartfelt attempt to bring national attention to issues he never truly considered. LGBTQ+ rights were something that, to him, had never fully entered his realm of concern. Yet as Naomi stepped out of the courtroom, a quiet unease settled over the judge. There was something about her unwavering resolve, the purpose in her eyes, that stayed with him long after the proceedings ended. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her than he had seen. Naomi Parker's journey didn't begin in a courthouse or on a protest line. It started in a small neighborhood where she learned from a young age that the world was often an unfair place. Growing up in a tight-knit but economically disadvantaged community, Naomi saw firsthand the ways in which people were judged based on the color of their skin, their gender, and eventually their sexual orientation. Her family, though full of love and support, struggled with their own battles against discrimination. Naomi was always the one who asked questions, the one who felt a deep sense of injustice when she saw someone left behind or mistreated. Her activism began in high school after a close friend came out as gay and was harassed by classmates. Naomi watched as the school administration, who were meant to protect students, brushed off the situation. It wasn't the first time she'd seen injustice, but this instance stuck with her. Why was it that some people could just ignore others' humanity because of who they loved? She decided to speak up, first in small ways, standing up during class discussions, speaking at school events. But as she grew older, Naomi realized her voice could do more than just raise awareness. It could spark real change. In college, Naomi threw herself into activism. She became involved with organizations advocating for both racial equality and LGBTQ+ rights, realizing that the two struggles were not separate but intertwined. Naomi learned about the disproportionate challenges faced by people of color in the LGBTQ+ community, issues like workplace discrimination, unequal access to health care, and violence against trans individuals. She knew she had to fight not just for one group, but for all those who faced compounded marginalization. By the time Naomi was in her late 20s, she had become a key figure in local activism. She wasn't afraid to take risks, speaking out about issues that others would rather ignore. One of her proudest achievements was founding a nonprofit organization focused on providing resources to LGBTQ+ youth of color, offering mentorship, legal aid, and safe spaces for those who felt abandoned by their families or communities. Naomi saw how difficult it was for young people to navigate both their racial identity and their sexual identity in a world that often refused to accept both. Her advocacy work soon expanded beyond the local level. Naomi organized protests, met with lawmakers, and partnered with national organizations to push for federal protections for LGBTQ+ people. She wanted to see a world where the government couldn't legally discriminate against someone based on their sexual orientation or gender identity. A world where everyone, no matter who they loved or how they identified, could live freely and without fear. Naomi's passion wasn't just about politics or laws. It was about people, the faces of those who had been silenced for far too long. Her work was her life's calling, and every step of her journey felt like an undeniable push toward justice. The protest in the park, though small, was another piece of that long fight. But to Judge Reynolds, it was just another disruption. What he didn't understand yet was that it was much more than that. It was the voice of change calling out, demanding to be heard. As Naomi walked out of the courthouse, the weight of the fine didn't sink in immediately. What lingered was the sting of being misunderstood, of having her cause reduced to a mere legal technicality. She had been standing up for something much bigger than herself, and yet in the eyes of the law, she was just another protester caught in a technical violation. Still, Naomi wasn't discouraged. If anything, the fine only strengthened her resolve. This was just another chapter in the larger story of fighting for equality. Within hours of the ruling, Naomi's supporters began to gather. What started as a small, quiet protest at the park had already begun to snowball into something bigger. Local activists, LGBTQ+ advocates, and community members from all walks of life began to rally around her cause. Social media exploded with messages of support, hashtags trending in solidarity with Naomi's fight. Word spread quickly, and the fine she had received became a symbol of the struggle many people faced in their fight for justice and equal rights. What Judge Reynolds hadn't realized was that Naomi wasn't just protesting for the LGBTQ+ community. She was amplifying the voices of those who had long been marginalized. Her protest was about making sure that people, regardless of their identity, could live freely without fear of discrimination. People from various parts of the town came forward to share their stories of prejudice they had experienced, whether it was being denied a job, facing unfair treatment in the healthcare system, or being ostracized by their families. Naomi's protest had become a rallying cry for them, a platform for all those whose struggles often went unheard. As the days passed, more and more people joined the movement. A rally was organized in front of the courthouse, with speakers addressing the crowd about the need for federal protections for LGBTQ+ individuals. Naomi's supporters passionately spoke about how the fine was a symbolic reminder of the many ways LGBTQ+ individuals continued to face institutionalized discrimination. For many, Naomi had become more than just a local activist. She was a symbol of resistance, standing up for what was right despite the risks. Judge Reynolds, watching from his office, began to feel a sense of unease. He'd seen the crowds growing, heard the voices rising in unity, but he didn't fully understand the depth of the movement. He had thought of Naomi's protest as a minor inconvenience, but now, as he saw the power of the message she was spreading, he couldn't ignore the growing conversation around him. The town was changing, and he was caught in the middle of it, unsure of how to respond. Still, the judge remained resolute in his decision. Until, in a twist of fate, an unexpected letter arrived at his desk, sparking a shift in his thinking. The letter, written by a local transgender woman, shared the painful story of discrimination she had faced and the crucial importance of the very protections Naomi was advocating for. The words on the page were a turning point for the judge. He was no longer just dealing with a case. He was confronted with the lives that were affected by the legal system's failures. Naomi's protest had become more than just a legal matter. It had become a call for empathy and action. While the town grappled with the fallout from Naomi's fine, her work continued. Naomi wasn't the kind of person to let setbacks derail her. She knew that the fine, while unjust, had brought her cause into the spotlight, and she was determined to use that attention to push forward. The protest in the park had been small, but it was part of a much larger campaign she had been building for years, one that would advocate for federal protections for LGBTQ+ individuals. Naomi was no stranger to the grind of advocacy. She had spent years organizing rallies, speaking at public forums, and meeting with lawmakers. But after the fine, her cause had taken on new urgency. She focused on expanding her efforts, reaching out to more organizations, and organizing grassroots campaigns in cities across the country. She knew that securing legal protections for the LGBTQ+ community wasn't just about passing laws. It was about changing hearts and minds. One of the cornerstones of Naomi's approach was ensuring that the issue was understood not in isolation, but as part of the broader fight for equality. She knew that for LGBTQ+ protections to gain widespread support, people had to see the connections between racial justice, gender equality, and LGBTQ+ rights. She often spoke about the unique struggles faced by LGBTQ+ people of color, how systemic racism compounded the challenges faced by people who already struggled to live authentically. Her nonprofit organization, which had started small, was now growing rapidly, providing resources and legal assistance to LGBTQ+ youth of color across the nation. She worked tirelessly to create safe spaces where young people could find mentorship and support, especially in communities where discrimination was still prevalent. Naomi was not just advocating for the right to be recognized by the law, but for the right to exist safely in a society that often saw them as invisible. The fine had also sparked something else in Naomi, a deep sense of responsibility. She understood that it wasn't just about making her voice heard. It was about amplifying the voices of those who felt powerless, those who had suffered in silence. Her campaign grew beyond just a legal initiative. It became a movement that called for dignity, respect, and a future where no one had to fear discrimination simply for who they were. As Naomi's movement expanded, she began to see tangible progress. Conversations about LGBTQ+ rights were becoming more common in mainstream politics. Some lawmakers, inspired by the energy of Naomi's campaign, began drafting bills aimed at protecting LGBTQ+ individuals. But for Naomi, this was just the beginning. Her ultimate goal was to ensure that LGBTQ+ protections became a fundamental part of federal law, something that couldn't be undone by future administrations or local lawmakers. Despite the long road ahead, Naomi was more committed than ever. The fine, rather than serving as a setback, had fueled her determination. She wasn't just advocating for a law. She was fighting for the dignity and safety of thousands of people across the country, people whose voices were finally being heard. As Naomi's campaign for LGBTQ+ protections gained momentum, the town's atmosphere began to shift. The once quiet streets hummed with the energy of ongoing rallies and discussions. What had started as a small protest in the park had transformed into a local movement, and Naomi's story was spreading far beyond the courthouse. Despite his firm stance, Judge Reynolds couldn't escape the growing awareness of Naomi's cause. Initially, the judge felt nothing but certainty about his decision. To him, Naomi's protest was a violation of the law, plain and simple. But as the weeks passed, he found himself surrounded by reminders of the growing tide of support for her cause. He received letters, petitions, and phone calls from people across the country, some in support of his ruling, but many urging him to reconsider. He even heard from colleagues within the legal system who, while not entirely convinced of the necessity of federal LGBTQ+ protections, suggested that Naomi's activism was part of a broader, important societal conversation. Then came the letter that truly challenged his perspective. a deeply personal message from a local transgender woman named Clara. Clara wrote about her struggles living in a town where people often treated her as invisible. She described the hardships of being denied housing, the struggles of finding a job, and the fear of being subjected to violence simply because of her identity. Clara spoke about how she had almost given up on ever finding legal protection, until she heard Naomi speak. Naomi had given her hope, reminding her that there were people out there who were fighting for change, who were pushing for laws that would protect people like her. Clara's words were powerful and unflinching. Judge Reynolds, who had prided himself on being impartial and clear-cut in his decisions, found himself deeply moved by Clara's story. He began to realize that his ruling wasn't just about a protest. It was about the larger issues at play. For the first time, he truly understood that Naomi's cause wasn't about mere politics or a protest to be squashed. It was about human dignity, about ensuring that people like Clara, like Naomi, had the legal protection they deserved. Despite his initial resistance, the judge began to question the assumptions he had held for so long. Was the law always clear-cut, or could it evolve to reflect the shifting landscape of society? Was it possible that, in upholding the letter of the law, he had ignored the spirit of justice? The once immovable figure behind the bench began to feel the weight of Naomi's cause, and it left him questioning his own role in the larger fight for equality. The more he thought about it, the more he began to realize that the world was changing, and perhaps it was time for him to change with it. Judge Reynolds sat at his desk late one evening, the courthouse quiet except for the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. His gaze drifted over the letters that had piled up on his desk, each one offering a different perspective on Naomi's case. Some were supportive of him, urging that the law be upheld no matter the cause. Others, however, told a different story, one that was harder to ignore. The letter from Clara had haunted him. Her words, raw and honest, had stayed with him longer than he cared to admit. He couldn't shake the feeling that his previous ruling, in its insistence on following procedure, had missed the deeper point. In the weeks following Naomi's fine, the judge had continued to hear about her from all corners of the town. Naomi's supporters held rallies in the park, organized meetings in local community centers, and shared powerful stories about the need for federal LGBTQ+ protections. Slowly, the judge began to feel something he hadn't expected: doubt. One evening, he attended a town hall where Naomi was the keynote speaker. She spoke not just as an activist, but as someone who had lived through the pain and the struggle of marginalization. Her voice resonated in a way that even the judge couldn't ignore. She shared stories of LGBTQ+ individuals who had been denied basic rights, people who had lost their jobs, been evicted from their homes, or even been denied medical care because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. Her words were filled with the faces of real people, their lives affected by a system that often failed them. Naomi's speech wasn't political, it was personal, and it made Judge Reynolds realize something he had never fully understood. This wasn't just about laws and rules. This was about the lives of people who had been pushed to the margins for far too long. It wasn't just about the disruption caused by one protest, but about the systemic injustice that Naomi was trying to expose. The more the judge thought about it, the more he realized that his duty wasn't just to uphold the law, but to ensure that the law served the people fairly. He had always believed that the law was a neutral force, but Naomi's case had shown him that the law often had a very human face, and that face was often the one least protected by the system. After the town hall, Judge Reynolds found himself reflecting long into the night. The black and white world he had once inhabited seemed a little grayer now. Could he, in good conscience, continue to stand by his previous decision? Was it possible that Naomi's protest was more than just a challenge to the status quo? It was a necessary call for change. The answer, he realized, was yes. Naomi's protest wasn't an act of rebellion, it was a plea for justice. And, in that moment, Judge Reynolds knew that his perspective would never be the same again. The question was no longer about whether he was right in his ruling. It was about whether he could stand on the right side of history. The days that followed were filled with quiet introspection for Judge Reynolds. He found himself increasingly unsettled by the weight of his earlier decision. He had always prided himself on making fair, impartial rulings, but this was different. This wasn't just a legal case, it was a human issue, and he had come to realize that the law, in its purest form, was meant to protect people, not silence them. Naomi's protest had ignited something in him that he hadn't expected. He had always believed that the law should be enforced without exception, but now he questioned whether that strict adherence had made him blind to the broader implications of his actions. Her words, and the voices of those who spoke in support of her, had been a wake-up call. He could no longer ignore the injustice that Naomi was fighting against, and more importantly, he could no longer ignore the truth that she was speaking. The turning point came one afternoon when he was alone in his chambers, reviewing the case again. The stack of letters, petitions, and personal stories that had flooded his office in recent weeks were scattered across his desk. Clara's letter was at the top. He read it once more, feeling the weight of her words settle in his chest. For the first time, he saw Naomi's protest not as a disruption, but as a catalyst for necessary change, a voice for those who had long been marginalized and ignored. Judge Reynolds picked up his phone and made a call to his clerk. He requested that a special hearing be scheduled, a hearing where Naomi Parker would be invited back to his courtroom. But this time, it would be different. This time, he wanted to hear her side of the story, not as a protester in defiance of the law, but as an advocate for justice. The decision wasn't made lightly. He knew it would be controversial, and there would be many who would see his actions as a weakness or a contradiction. But he had come to realize something far more important than saving face. He had to do what was right. His role as a judge wasn't just about enforcing laws. It was about seeking fairness and ensuring that the legal system worked for everyone, especially those who were most vulnerable. When Naomi received the call about the special hearing, she was surprised but also encouraged. She had not expected the judge to reconsider, let alone ask for a meeting with her. This was an unexpected shift, one that she hadn't even thought was possible. But she agreed, understanding that this could be a moment of true change, one that could push her cause even further into the public consciousness. As the date for the hearing drew closer, Naomi prepared to meet Judge Reynolds, knowing that this could be the beginning of something powerful. What had once seemed like an obstacle was now an opportunity. She had no idea how the meeting would unfold, but she was ready to speak truth to power, as she always had. What mattered now was that the conversation was happening, and that, in itself, was progress. The day of the special hearing arrived with an air of anticipation. Naomi had prepared herself for anything, but she knew that today was different. This wasn't just another protest or rally. It was an opportunity to sit face to face with Judge Reynolds and explain why her cause was about more than just a legal violation. It was about human dignity and equality. Judge Reynolds sat at his desk, the weight of the decision heavy on his shoulders. He had spent the past few weeks grappling with the realization that his earlier ruling had been more than just a legal oversight. It had been a missed opportunity to recognize the deeper need for change. He had come to understand that Naomi's protest wasn't just about defying authority. It was about giving a voice to those who had been silenced for far too long. And now, as she entered the courtroom, he knew this was his chance to make things right. Naomi walked in confidently, her head held high, as she had done countless times before in her advocacy work. But there was something different about this moment. She wasn't walking into a courtroom to defend herself against a fine. She was walking in to make a case for justice, a case that had the potential to change not only her own life, but the lives of countless others. Judge Reynolds greeted her with a nod. "Ms. Parker," he said, his tone respectful but cautious, "thank you for agreeing to meet today." Naomi nodded in return. "Thank you for giving me the opportunity, Your Honor. I know this isn't easy." There was a long pause before the judge spoke again. "I've had the chance to read the letters, hear the stories, and think deeply about this. I realize now that I may have missed the point entirely. This fine wasn't just a violation of the law. It was a symptom of a much larger issue, a failure to recognize the need for protections for those who have been marginalized for too long. I want to hear from you, Ms. Parker. I want to understand. Naomi felt a wave of relief wash over her. This wasn't going to be an interrogation or a courtroom battle. This was a conversation, a dialogue that, for once, seemed to be open to hearing the truth. She began to speak, her words coming easily, as they always did when she spoke about the importance of LGBTQ+ protections. She told the judge about the countless stories she had heard from individuals who were afraid to live authentically because of the risk of discrimination. She spoke about the violence faced by transgender people of color, the lack of health care, and the unfair treatment in workplaces and schools. Naomi's voice cracked a little as she described the hope she felt each time someone told her that her activism had given them courage. "What I'm fighting for," she said, "is the right for every person to live without fear. Whether they're LGBTQ+, a person of color, or anyone who feels invisible in this world." Judge Reynolds listened intently, his face softening with each word. For the first time, he understood. The law was not just about enforcing rules. It was about ensuring that everyone had the same protections, the same rights, the same opportunities to live without fear. When Naomi finished speaking, there was a long silence. Finally, Judge Reynolds spoke again, his voice steady but sincere. "Ms. Parker, I made a mistake. You were right to protest. You were right to raise your voice. I now understand that the law must serve not just the letter of the rules, but the spirit of justice. I can't undo what I've done, but I will make sure this is a lesson I carry forward. I'll work towards supporting the change that's needed." Naomi smiled, not out of triumph, but with the quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing that change had truly begun. What started as a fine had turned into a transformative moment, not just for her, but for Judge Reynolds and, in time, for the community as a whole. It was a reminder that justice was not always found in the rules, but in the willingness to listen, learn, and grow.